1. America and the Great War, 1914-1920. These are your core objectives. Please review those as you're reading the chapter. In June of 1914, the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, Francis Ferdinand, and his wife Sophie were assassinated while they visited Bosnia, one of the remote provinces of the empire. At this time, the Bosnian people were trying to gain their independence from Austria-Hungary. They were part of a larger nationalist movement in Eastern Europe, especially led by the Slavic people. And Serbia, a neighboring Slavic country, had given Bosnia a lot of assistance in their endeavors to gain independence. The assassin, while he was a Bosnian, was actually trained in Serbia for the assassination. He was part of a militant group called the Black Hand. And so when the Archduke was assassinated, the Emperor of Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia for the assassination and declared war on Serbia. This is the beginning of World War I, because at this time, leading into the war, beginning in the 1890s, Europe had been basically dividing itself into two armed camps. And so there were all these entangling military alliances. So Serbia had an alliance with Russia. So when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, Russia then declared war on Austria-Hungary. Well, Austria-Hungary then had an alliance with Germany, because Austria-Hungary and Germany were predominantly Germanic peoples. So when Russia declared war on Austria-Hungary, Germany declared war on Russia. And so then you see it's like a row of dominoes. Well, when Germany declared war on Russia, Russia and France have an alliance because they both don't like Germany. And their alliance said that if either country went to war with Germany, then the other country would come to their aid. So when Germany declared war on Russia, then France declares war on Germany. So within a week, we have most of the major powers of Europe at war with each other. In World War I, the two sides are going to be called the Central Powers and the Allies. The Central Powers are Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, which today is Turkey, but would include some more provinces than just Turkey, and Bulgaria. The Allies are Great Britain, France, Russia. Italy joins the Allies in 1915, and the United States joins the Allies in 1917. In the initial days of the war, in the late summer of 1914, it was only France and Russia allied together. Great Britain had stayed out of the conflict, hoping that they could remain neutral. But events will occur in Belgium that we're going to talk about in a minute that will push Great Britain into the war by the early fall of 1914. This is just a map of Europe that shows you the Central Powers, the Allied powers, and the neutral nations. So you can see how those Central Powers are all kind of in the center of Europe and how they all kind of lined up. In the early years of the 20th century, Germany had developed a plan for war in case they went to war against both Russia and France at the same time. A plan that they hoped would keep them from having to really divide their forces. This plan was called the Schlieffen Plan. The plan called for moving very quickly against France, moving through Belgium because that was the quickest route from Germany to Paris, the capital of France, quickly defeating the French, and then turning their attention toward their eastern borders with Russia. The plan is going to fall apart for several reasons. One, the Russians, who were a less industrialized country, were considered by the Germans to be inferior, and they thought it would take the Russians a long time to mobilize for war. it did not take the Russians very long to mobilize for war. The Tsar was able to get his armies going, and very quickly began moving the Russian armies toward the German border. And so Germany will end up having to split their forces. A second thing that the Schlieffen Plan counted on was that the British would remain neutral when the German armies moved through Belgium. See, back after the Napoleonic Wars in the late mid-19th century, Belgium had been declared a neutral nation, and all of the powers of Europe had promised to respect Belgium's neutrality. However, because of the fact that the German crown and the English crown were related, they were cousins, the Germans felt that Great Britain would not declare war on them. However, when the German armies moved through Belgium, Great Britain felt that they had an obligation to the Belgian people to defend them, and so they will then declare war on Germany, and then began mobilizing British armies to France. So that's going to change the whole picture for what's going to happen in France. When the German armies get to France, they are not just going to be facing the French, who they felt that they could easily defeat, but they're going to be facing the French and the British, who they had much more respect for. And so it throws the whole timeline of the plan off. The Germans do get bogged down into a two-front war. However, even in the beginning, it looked like the Germans may be successful in taking Paris, and by the early fall of 1914, the German army was just outside of Paris around the Marne River. And this is where we're going to have the first battle of the Marne. The French armies, reinforced by the British armies, are going to dig in along the Marne River, and they are going to be able to hold off the Germans, and the Germans will not be able to cross the Marne and move in to take Paris. This is where the war on the Western Front, the war in France, will bog down really for the rest of the engagement. And it is after the first battle of the Marne that we see the Western Front moving into what we call trench warfare, which we greatly identify with the First World War. And now the British and the French and the Germans are going to be digging these long trenches for miles and miles, tearing up the French countryside and fighting from those trenches. Meanwhile, along the Eastern Front, the Russian armies are beginning to invade Germany, and so the Germans are having to fight a two-front war, which no military ever wants to have to do. When we look at World War I, it propels us into a new age of warfare, or even more modern age of warfare than we had seen in the Civil War. And that's mainly because there were new innovations of war. We just talked about the trench warfare, which is really synonymous with World War I. The trenches were not just the places that the armies fought, but they actually lived in these for days and sometimes even weeks at a time. They were very deep, usually, as much as 6 to 7 feet deep, so that the soldiers could live there. There's a picture here on this slide where you can see that a soldier is standing up, and you can see the trench is just a little bit above his head when you look at the sandbags that are on top. And we think of the trench warfare really with the armies going over the top, meaning, charging up over the tops of the trenches and fighting each other. The trenches were usually very close together, so you could actually see your enemy oftentimes among these trenches. Another innovation of war was the machine gun. The machine gun eventually became the military's primary firearm during the war. Poison gas was also introduced by the Germans in 1915. It's another one of those innovations of war. Eventually they discovered that the poison gas was just very inhumane, and after the war is over, the use of poison gas and chemical weapons is going to be outlawed. But we see on this screen, you can also see one of the gas masks, the early gas masks that were used during World War I. The poison gas that was used during World War I, the primary one was a mustard gas, which attacked the nervous system of the soldiers and often killed them very quickly. If it did not kill them, it paralyzed them, and then they would succumb to machine gun fire or artillery fire oftentimes. And even if they did survive a gas attack, to the end of the war, sometimes they would have nerve damage that lasted forever. Tanks were also invented in World War I by the British. The British introduced the first tanks in 1916, and there's a picture of one of the early tanks here. The tanks of World War I are going to be very different than the tanks we see being used in World War II. There's going to be a huge improvement of the tanks. The tanks were really a byproduct of the trench warfare because horses and cavalry were still used a great deal during World War I, but as the trenches got longer and deeper, the horses could not move through those areas, and you couldn't use regular automobiles, which were also beginning to be utilized by the armies. And so the tanks, because they're on these treads, they were designed to move over those trenches. The early tanks were very slow. They moved about 10, maybe 15, at the height maybe 15 miles an hour or so. They usually did not have revolving turrets, so they really could just shoot directly in front of them. Much smaller and compact than what we will see by the time we get to World War II, because there'll be a lot of innovation, especially by the Germans, for the World War II tanks. Airplanes were also used for the first time in World War I. Of course, air travel is very new by the early 20th century. In the beginning, airplanes were used mostly for reconnaissance, just flying over and seeing where your enemy was. But eventually they began to see that the airplanes could actually be used in battle, and we began to see airplanes being used as support and being included in strategies for battles. And we also began to see those what they called the dogfights between the famous like Red Baron and other pilots during the war. Of course, one of the big innovations that we see being utilized during this war were the U-boats, or what we in America call submarines. The Germans had seized on those early experimentations from the Americans during the Civil War of using submarines, and by World War I, they had developed a functioning U-boat or submarine. The use of the U-boats is going to cause a lot of friction between the Germans and the United States, and actually is one of the causes for the United States ultimately siding with the Allies. The U-boats, because of their early design, violated many of what at the time were the rules of war. For example, one of the rules of war was that before you engaged in a naval battle, you were supposed to fire a warning shot over the bow of your enemy. Well, the U-boats were designed strictly for surprise attacks, and so if the U-boat rose up out of the depths of the water and fired a warning shot over the bow of the ship it was about to attack, it really became like a sitting duck on the water, and so that was not something that the Germans wanted to do, so they ignored that rule of war. Another thing that was a rule of war at the time was that if you sank a ship in battle, you were supposed to rescue the survivors of that ship. Well, the early U-boats are so small, they can't take on any other personnel, so when they do attack these ships and they sink them, the survivors were just left there to die in the elements of the Atlantic. Either the sharks would get them or they would die from exposure and cold. So because of the use of the U-boats, the Americans, well before we got involved in the war, began to view the Germans as being barbaric, and we began to move closer and closer to siding with the British and the French. On this slide, I've just given you some pictures of some of those innovations of war. You can see those early U-boats by comparison of what we are going to see even in World War II. They're much smaller than what we'll see in World War II, and definitely much smaller than what our modern submarines are. Then we have one of our large artillery pieces. This is really just a little more accurate type of cannon, really, from the Civil War age. It moves on wheels. At times, the Germans and the English would use horses to pull these artillery pieces. Sometimes, if they could, they would move these artillery pieces by trucks if they could get them across the trenches. And then in the lower corner, we see a picture of one of the early airplanes. It's those open cockpit biplanes that were used during that time. As we were just saying on the earlier slides, the use of the submarines began to cause a great deal of tension between the United States and Germany, even though the United States was neutral at the time. And one of the first big instances that caused an uproar between the two countries was the sinking of the Lusitania. The Lusitania was a British luxury liner, so it's one of those big ships like the Titanic. And the Lusitania had landed in the port of New York, and it had taken on passengers, and it was on its way back to Europe when it was sunk by the Germans in May of 1915. When the Lusitania was sunk, there were 1,200 people on board who were killed, and 128 of those were Americans. So you can imagine we were horribly outraged at this incident and demanded an apology from the Germans. Now, to be quite honest, the Germans had warned Americans not to travel on the Lusitania. For years, since the beginning of the war, the Germans had accused the British of using luxury liners, non-combat vessels, to move what they called contraband of war, to move weapons, basically hiding behind civilians to move weapons into Europe. And they had warned Americans that they felt that the Lusitania was being used to move contraband, and if given the opportunity, they were going to sink it. So they took out big ads in American newspapers warning Americans not to travel on board the Lusitania, which we mostly ignored. And as I said, 128 Americans were killed in that incident. We're upset, we're outraged, but not to the point that we want to declare war, because we still are trying to stay out of the war. Then the next year, not quite even a full year later, in March of 1916, another non-combatant vessel, this time a French vessel, the Sussex, was sunk in the English Channel. There were 28 Americans on board the ship. None of them died, and actually the death rates in the sinking of the Sussex is not nearly as high because they were able to rescue most of the people there. But now the Americans are just totally outraged, and at this time, President Wilson sends Germany an ultimatum saying that if they continue to sink unarmed vessels, then we will have to declare war. Well, Germany did not want the United States to get involved in the war, because really, at this time, Germany was winning the war. And they didn't want the Americans to come in and help the British and the French. So Germany then issued what became known as the Sussex Pledge. In the Sussex Pledge, the Germans promised that they will discontinue what was called unrestricted submarine warfare. Unrestricted submarine warfare is when they would just attack any ships that were flying the flag of their enemies, the British, the French, the Russians. It didn't matter if it was a merchant vessel, if it was a naval vessel, if it was a civilian luxury liner, whatever. If it was flying the flag of their enemy, they would sink it. And they've promised now that they will stop this unrestricted submarine warfare. That was good enough for President Wilson at the time because the mood in America was, we want to stay out of the war. And so 1916 is a presidential election year. And so Wilson can go into that election saying, you know, he got concessions from the Germans, but he kept us out of war. And that was actually one of the campaign slogans, was he kept us out of war. Well, the Sussex Pledge actually ended up being a kind of a military disaster for the Germans. And it actually proved that the Germans were correct, that the Allies were using non-combatant vessels to move military goods into Europe. So after they promised not to attack these ships and discontinued attacking the ships, the war really began to turn against the Germans. And so by January of 1917, the Germans decided that they would revoke the Sussex Pledge, and they informed the United States and everyone else that they would resume unrestricted submarine warfare. Now, the Germans know that this may mean ultimately that they will go to war with the United States, but they're really desperate at this point because the war is going very badly for them. And they're also hoping that if they do end up going to war with the United States, we're across the Atlantic. We have notably been a neutral nation. We don't keep a large standing army or a large navy. And so they're hoping that if we do decide to come into the war, that it will take us so long to mobilize for war that they can defeat the French and the British before we become a major factor. They also tried to entice one of our neighbors to join the Central Powers in the war. The idea here was that if Mexico would join the Central Powers, then the United States couldn't send large armies to Europe, and we would not become a factor in the European war. So the Germans sent what became known as the Zimmermann telegram to Mexico, asking Mexico to join the Central Powers, and in promising that if Germany and Mexico won the war, that Germany would make sure that Mexico would regain all of the land that they had ever lost to the United States. So that would include things like, you know, Texas and Arizona, California, you know, much of the Southwest. The Zimmermann telegram was intercepted by the British, who very happily then sent that information to the United States. And so you can imagine that the response in the United States was not positive for Germany, because we already have this attitude that they're very barbaric. They've been attacking civilian vessels, killing innocent people, and now they're trying to entice our neighbors to go to war against us. Now, keep in mind from our previous chapters, Mexico was still angry with us at this time because this is soon after the Pancho Villa incident. So the Germans thought they had a good chance of getting Mexico to join them. By the way, of course, Mexico did not join them. They remained neutral in the war. But once the Zimmermann telegram became public knowledge, Woodrow Wilson will then go to Congress and ask Congress for a declaration of war. And in this very famous war message, Woodrow Wilson says that the United States must go to war to make the world safe for democracy. And he refers to World War I as the war to end all wars, so that we can go to war. Yes, it's going to be hard, but if we win this war, we can make sure that the war ends all war forever. So it's kind of naive, but it's what Americans wanted to hear, and the war declaration will pass. So in April of 1917, the United States will declare war on Germany, and we will enter World War I. Well, once war was declared, the United States did have to mobilize for war, but it will not take as nearly as long to mobilize for war as the Germans believed that it would. Actually, within 3 months, by June of 1917, we're actually going to have our first armies in France. Not a huge force, but we will have some armies in France by June of 1917. But we do have to be in organizing for war. And one of the first things we have to do is make sure we will have enough soldiers to fight that war. And so Congress will pass the Selective Service Act. Basically, this is the draft. And this is just in case enough people don't volunteer for war, they can draft men into the service. Another thing that we will have to do, of course, is finance the war. This war will be financed, like most wars, by increasing taxes, but they will also sell war bonds. In World War I, the war bonds were called Liberty bonds. And there's a picture here on this slide that shows some women selling war bonds, selling these Liberty bonds, enticing people to, do their part. The nice thing about like the Liberty bonds, and we'll use the same thing in World War II, they sold them in very small increments, and so the average person could make a contribution to the war effort. Another thing, of course, that you have to do is make sure that you have the tools for war. And so the War Industries Board was created. And basically what this does is it puts all industries under the War Industry Board. And the War Industries Board will then ensure that the factories are mobilized to begin making war materials. For example, instead of making civilian cars, you'll begin to make military trucks. Instead of making civilian airplanes, you'll be making airplanes for the armed forces, and you'll make sure that you have tires for those airplanes and those trucks. And so you will convert factories to making more firearms. And so the War Industries Board is going to ensure that that occurs, because we have to have the tools for war. Another thing, of course, that you have to have for your soldiers is food. And so the Food Administration was created, and the Food Administration encouraged farmers to increase production of food items. And so we do see a massive increase in food production at this time. By the end of World War I, the United States is feeding not just our armies, but we're feeding the British and the French as well, since much of the French farmland was destroyed by the trenches. Once the War Industries Board was created and we began to mobilize those factories for war, we realized we're going to need more workers, because many of the men are going to be going off to fight in the war. And so women began to move into non-traditional workplace roles. And these were both African American women and white women who have mostly worked in more traditional housekeeping roles or worked in textile factories. But now we're going to see women moving into working in these huge munitions factories, building weapons, building bombs, building tanks. About 100,000 women are estimated to have worked in these munitions factories. Because of the women's role in World War I, it increases the status of women in the country, and the women's suffrage movement gains a great deal of momentum during World War I. So it's not really surprising that soon after World War I is over, the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote will be passed. Prohibition, which was also a huge part of the women's suffrage movement, many of the same women that worked for women's suffrage worked for Prohibition, will also gain a great deal of momentum during this time. And also we will see that even before women get the right to vote, the 18th Amendment will be passed outlawing alcohol in the country. African Americans also gained a lot of opportunities during this war, not just African American women, but African American men. They began to move into more of the factory work, and we see this huge migration from the South into northern cities like Chicago and Detroit to work in these huge factories up there. And many of them, when the war's over, they will stay in those cities and not come back to the South to resume farming. Another thing that we wanted to do in this war was to make sure that everyone was 100% behind the war. And so there's a huge movement to sell the war to people, to gain public support for the war. And so the Creel Committee, which is also referred to as the Committee of Public Information, or the CPI, was created for this purpose. The Creel Committee put out a lot of propaganda posters. Some of propaganda is not always negative. Some of it was, like we saw on the previous slide, encouraging people to grow more food. But then also like this poster on this slide that shows people talking in like a spider web, saying don't talk. You don't know basically who's around you listening, so you need to be careful of what you're saying. They also put out some negative propaganda depicting the Germans as brutal Huns and those types of things, to really encourage people to support the war, paint the Germans in a very bad light, and really just encourage recruitment. It is during World War I that we see a huge movement of using the Uncle Sam figure, you know, that "we want you," that picture. But we also see during the war some curtailment of First Amendment rights. And this is not the first time we've seen this, and we'll see some of this again in World War II, but maybe not as blatant as we see in World War I. In World War I, Congress will pass the Espionage Act. The Espionage Act provided severe penalties on anyone who was found guilty of what they said was obstructing recruitment, who was aiding the enemy, criticizing the war, if you were being subordinate, being insubordinate, if you refused your draft, all of those things, those were called, you would be susceptible to the Espionage Act. Also, under the Espionage Act, the Postmaster General was given the power to not deliver any mail that was considered to be anti-American. And so we see during this time period where we have very many first-generation German Americans, if letters were written in German, the Postmaster General would not deliver those. You definitely didn't want people to hear you speaking German because you might be considered to be a spy and you could be prosecuted under the Espionage Act. Another act that was passed was the Sedition Act. The Sedition Act made it illegal for you to speak against the war, against the flag, against Congress, the president. If you were critical in any way, you would be charged, and if found guilty, you would go to jail for sedition. So obviously these are huge curtailments of the First Amendment, but during wartime we see sometimes these types of things do happen. Basically, that we are trying to keep down any dissent, any type of negative talk about the government or the war, promoting this 100% Americanism. The American military force that went to Europe to fight in World War I was called the American Expeditionary Force, the AEF. The overall commanding general of the AEF was General John Pershing. This is the same General Pershing that we talked about previously that had chased Pancho Villa around Mexico for a year unsuccessfully. This is one of those recruiting posters I was showing you, the Uncle Sam. I want you for the U.S. Army. They're really encouraging people to join the military. They will have to use the draft some during World War I, but many people did join the Army in these forces. The American Expeditionary Force will reach the shores of France, as I said earlier, in June of 1917. American actual military involvement in World War I lasted really less than you would expect. It only lasted really about a year, a little over a year. And in the first months of that experience, the U.S. was not really acting on its own. We were acting as support for the French and the British. And it's really not going to be until 1918 that the U.S. really begins to show its full value in the war. And this was a planned strategy, mainly because the U.S. forces were not accustomed to the trench warfare, and so it was agreed on by the Allies that the American units would be incorporated with the French and the British units to become accustomed to this new type of warfare. one of the first major engagements that the U.S. is going to be engaged in June of 1918, about a year after we've gotten there, is the Battle of Chateau Thierry. By this time, the Germans have gone on the offensive again, trying to defeat the French before more American soldiers get into Europe. And so they've launched this major offensive to retake lands that they've lost and to try to once again take Paris. By June of 1918, the Germans were about 50 miles outside of Paris at this estate of Chateau Thierry. The Americans will fight alongside the French in the Battle of Chateau Thierry, and they will be able to halt the German advance there. However, it's not the end of this German offensive. They are beginning to see that they have to defeat the French as quickly as possible because the more and more Americans that come in. So a few weeks later, they're going to launch another major offensive against the French, trying to get to Paris. And once again, the major armies are going to end up at the Marne River, and we're going to have the Second Battle of the Marne River. This time, about 85,000 American soldiers are going to participate in the battle, and our role there is going to be to defend a certain section along that line of the Marne. And we proved to be very good in that role, and because of our participation, the Germans were turned back at the Second Battle of the Marne. When we look at the Second Battle of the Marne, it is usually considered to be the turning point of World War I on the Western Front, because after this, even though the Germans are going to try continuously to take Paris, they're not going to be able to. And after the Second Battle of the Marne, we do begin to see that the Germans are on their last legs. They will begin to have to regroup and reorganize, and we'll begin to see some retreating after the Second Battle of the Marne. Later in that summer, the Germans are going to launch another major offensive, and this one is a general offensive where they're throwing everything that they have at the Allied lines all throughout the Western Front. And because we had shown ourselves very well at the Second Battle of the Marne, this time the Americans are going to be assigned our own specific theater to defend in September of 1918, and that theater is at Saint-Mihiel. Saint-Mihiel was an area that the Germans had controlled since the beginning of the war, so since 1914, so for about 4 years at this time. They were very heavily entrenched there. They were dug in. They had concrete embattlements, everything that you can think. And so the Battle of Saint-Mihiel is going to be a 4-day battle that the Americans will be engaged in, and it will be a very horrific battle. During the course of that 4-day battle, 7,000 Americans were killed in 4 days. But in the end, we were successful, and we were able to take that Saint-Mihiel area from the Germans. The Battle of Saint-Mihiel is one of those landmark battles in military history because it is the first time that we see organized use of the Air Force in a support role, and it using the Air Force in a really strategic role in the battle. The Lafayette Escadrille was the French Air Force that will fight at the Battle of Saint-Mihiel. And even though it was French, they were French planes, many of the pilots were Americans. And actually, even the commander was an American, Colonel Billy Mitchell, who we'll see becomes very famous during World War II. And the Lafayette Escadrille will be used to strafe the enemy, not just to point out where they are and let us know, troop strength and things like that. But as a strategic part of the battle plan, the Lafayette Escadrille was to fly over the German lines and to bomb them and shoot at the soldiers there on the ground. And so it was so successful that they decided that this was something we would utilize in future engagements. In that fall of 1918, in this major German offensive, the Germans really are desperate, because by this time they are beginning to run out of soldiers, they're beginning to run out of food. As more and more Americans come into the war, they're beginning to be more and more outnumbered in the war, and the American Navy is beginning to cut off their access to supplies. So Germany is really in a very difficult situation, and we realize that, and as a counter move, the Allies are going to launch their own offensive in the fall of 1918, and it is known as the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, because it's between the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest, which is back in Belgium. So it's a very huge area that we're talking about with the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. And in this battle, once again, in this offensive, the United States is going to play a very decisive role. Over 1 million Americans actually participated in the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, and we were actually assigned another area of our own to defend and to take from the Germans. During the course of the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, which lasted for several weeks, there will be 120,000 American casualties. That's just American casualties. That's not all Allied casualties. But by the end of September, it was proven that the Allies, with American support, with our vast resources, the food coming in from America, the supplies coming in from America, the weapons, and the massive number of Americans, that the Germans were not going to be able to sustain the war effort. And because of that, by the end of September, a lot of the German allies began to drop out of the war. In September of 1918, Bulgaria will surrender to the Allies. Then in October, the Ottoman Empire and Austria-Hungary, where the war had started, surrendered and dropped out of the war. So that left Germany all by herself in the war. And so Germany begins to look at this once Austria-Hungary drops out of the war, and they decide that they cannot continue the war effort. And so in November of 1918, they will ask for an armistice. Now, it's important to note that an armistice is not a surrender. In November of 1918, when Germany asked for this armistice, they had not been invaded. Germany had not been invaded by the Western Allies at all. And so they did not believe that they were defeated, but to stave off that defeat, they wanted to enter some type of negotiated peace. So they don't believe that they're defeated. They want to stop fighting. They want to discuss peace terms. By November of 1914, Woodrow Wilson has issued his plan for a fair and equitable peace, also known as the 14 points. And so the armistice was supposed to be based on these 14 points. And on November 11th, 1918, when it was agreed that the guns on the battlefield would stop and we would enter this armistice, it was agreed by all of the powers at the time that the peace negotiations would be based on those 14 points. This map shows us the battles on the Western Front from 1914 to 1918. The arrows in that hot pink color, those are the Germans, the blue are the Allied, and you can see that the lighter brown lines, that's where the front was stabilized. The darker brown lines, those are the furthest German advances in the war, which you can see is well into France. And then that blue line is the armistice line. What that means is that's basically where the armies were, or if they weren't there, that's where they will withdraw to when the armistice goes into effect on November 11th, 1918. And so all of the German armies will be east of that blue line, and the Allied armies will be west of that blue line. This concludes part 1 of Chapter 21 PowerPoint presentation. Part 2 will begin with the 14 points and the peace negotiations.